museum of boring things. Here, ordinary objects rest beneath the hush of time. We gather not for spectacle, but for stillness, to trace the quiet ingenuity pressed into everyday form. Tonight's exhibit is a USB stick, fashioned in obscurity, indispensable in practice, carrying the soft weight of anonymous invention. Let your thoughts uncoil and your breath settle in. Should drowsiness arrive before our story concludes, consider it a courtesy of the collection. Now, let us open the glass case and listen for the silence between its hinges. Here we observe it, small, muted, and patient. A plastic tab, capped or uncapped, bearing a soft glint of brushed metal or scuffed anonymity. It neither whirs nor ticks. No faint buzz, no magnetic hum, only a gentle inertia, as though it waits to remember something you've forgotten. Its stillness conceals a former pulse, electrical, digital, invisible to the eye. And yet, beneath this quiet casing, one stirred a lattice of instructions, fragments of thought, spreadsheets, laughter, entire vacations captured as JPEGs. But before we arrive at this humble reliquary of the modern age, we must step back into the silent, swirling soup of mineral and molecule that came long before memory had form. In the bowels of the earth, long before light bulbs or inboxes, lay silicon, cloaked in stone and secrecy. It did not advertise its potential. It simply waited, quietly oxidized, nestled among quartz veins and tectonic calm. In its natural state, it was no more promising than a grain of dry rice. But to those who dared to melt, refine, and align it with gold and impulse, it became something more, a conduit, a whispering gate between the solid and the intangible. In the dream world of semiconductors, silicon was not the loudest element, but it was the most patient. It permitted electrons to pass only when coaxed with courtesy. It made no demands. It accepted logic as its master, voltage as its voice. In time, clever fingers learned to tame this elemental modesty. They etched it with channels no wider than a virus and mapped into it the invisible latticework of intention. Through these translucent corridors, information could skip like flat stones over still water. These were the ancestors of memory, of storage, of binary trust. The USB stick owes its breathless utility to these delicate structures, miniaturized cathedrals of yes and no. There was, of course, a moment when the idea itself took form. Not yet plastic, not yet pocket-sized, but present, if only as a murmur in a conference room where coffee cooled too slowly. A handful of engineers, politely disappointed by the tedium of rewritable CDs and the enigmatic moods of floppy disks, began to imagine a solution that neither spun nor scratched. What they sought was quiet permanence, portable certainty. No moving parts, just stillness that could speak when asked. The earliest prototypes were not elegant. They bulged and blinked and begged for understanding. Their capacity was barely adequate for a well-fed document. Yet even then, the shape was familiar, a soft rectangle, a plug, a promise. It was not grace they pursued, but compliance. It had to fit, not just in the computer, but in the logic of the moment, the click of insertion, the absence of delay, the unceremonious drag and drop. The first true USB stick, once it arrived, did so without applause. It did not require drivers or prayers. It simply worked, and in doing so, became invisible. Here in the museum, it sits upright in its display, neither proud nor apologetic. The label beneath reads only, USB storage device, anonymous debut, for no single hand claims authorship. There were murmurs in multiple laboratories, patents in multiple nations. One called it a dongle, another a drive. Some insisted on flash memory, others mumbled about EEPROM like monks chanting in hexadecimal, but all agreed on its worth: small, stolid, slightly untrustworthy when wet. The material shell evolved with it. Early plastics gave way to alloys, rubber grips, and in some extravagant cases, novelty figurines. The technology inside remained elusive, shrinking ever further until the idea of it became larger than the object. What once occupied a shelf in the data center now dangled from a lanyard or slept forgotten in the washing machine. And even now, as you breathe gently into this moment, the USB stick remains, not at the forefront of innovation, perhaps, but not quite obsolete either. It lingers in desk drawers and conference swag bags. It waits in jacket pockets, blinking politely, its last upload dated several seasons ago. The modern machine may eye it with suspicion, its ports no longer shaped to accommodate the past. But still, the USB stick endures. Not because it insists on relevance, but because it requires so little to be useful. So we begin, with silicon and shadows, with intention etched in ions, and a small rectangular thing that chose not to speak unless spoken to. The exhibit continues, unchanged in appearance, but gently expanded in context. Its presence, though muted, invites reflection. It is neither ostentatious nor nostalgic, and yet it contains the blueprint of a quiet revolution, one that did not march or shout, but instead slotted in, stored, and stepped back, following its formative murmurs in boardrooms and labs. The USB stick began to assert itself in polite increments. The underlying principle was not new. Flash memory, so named for its ability to erase data in a flash, had been theorized and trialed in earlier incarnations. Yet until the advent of a standardized plug, a universal handshake between device and machine, these ideas remained unsettled, floating like half-formed bridges in the fog of competing formats. The introduction of the USB interface itself, Universal Serial Bus, was an act of infrastructural diplomacy. It promised to simplify the tangled jungle of ports and plugs that haunted the backs of beige computers. Printers, scanners, keyboards, mice, each once demanded a different shape, a different cable, a different prayer. USB offered a unified solution, and with it, the stage was quietly set for an object that could slip from one system to the next without ceremony. The USB stick was not born from necessity, but from an opportunity disguised as convenience. Its early adopters were not always believers. In many offices, the stick was met with suspicion, a tiny foreign agent claiming to carry large volumes of data without a single moving part. There were mutterings of voodoo. Could it truly store 20 files? 50? A whole folder of spreadsheets and a family vacation? And could it do so silently, without spin or noise, without the scratchy theatrics of burning a CD? The answer, oddly, was yes. The inner architecture of the device, though hidden, had become a miracle of compression and cooperation. Inside, a microscopic symphony played between the controller chip, the NAND flash memory cells, and the connector itself, each acting without fuss, each speaking in electric whispers. Where once a roomful of machines hummed, now a single chip clicked politely through protocols invisible to the naked eye. drag, drop, and remove with relative grace. Whether they remembered to eject it properly was another matter, and so it spread, not as a disruptive force, but as a quiet guest that refused to leave. Conference tables began to sprout them. Teachers passed them between lessons like chalk. Students used them as pendants, keychains, or shoe toys. Entire departments archived their collective knowledge onto a device smaller than a stick of gum, unaware that its cap, often lost, would become the single most enduring mystery of its ownership. Designers, ever alert to novelty, began to experiment with forms. USB sticks emerged in the shapes of cartoon characters, bullets, sushi rolls, miniature saxophones. Some were disguised as pens, others as lighters. A few were encased in wood, leather, or the suggestion of gold. These were not merely tools, they were objects of idle affection, given as gifts, forgotten in drawers, rediscovered with a click of recognition and the faint hope that the contents remained intact. Yet even as it embedded itself in the daily drift of human activity, the USB stick remained a paradox. It offered permanence through impermanence. The data inside was persistent but fragile, eternal but contingent. An accidental drop, a static charge, a brief dip into coffee, all could dissolve its cargo in silence, and still we trusted it. Perhaps because it was simple, perhaps because it asked so little in return. Factories adapted. Where once floppy disks required precise mechanical assembly, USB sticks could be mass-produced with fewer moving parts and greater consistency. Machines soldered circuits onto tiny boards, embedded them into molded casings, and packed them by the thousands. Some bore logos, others bore nothing at all, silent messengers awaiting instructions. Warehouses stacked them like modern seeds, each one capable of storing an entire dissertation or just a single, poorly lit photo of a cat named Herbert. In the museum, we keep one of the early commercial models encased in a softly lit plinth. Its plastic is slightly yellowed, its contacts dulled by time. It is not elegant, but it is honest. This particular specimen once belonged to an intern at a long-defunct startup. On it, a single PDF and an MP3 file titled Presentation, Final 3 MP3. It will never play, but it remains. What distinguished the USB stick from its predecessors was not just its capacity, nor its portability, but its ambivalence. It did not care what it held. A poem, a virus, a child's drawing in Microsoft Paint. It welcomed all with equal silence. It was not an editor, not a judge. It was a vessel, a platonic pocket for the digital soul. And so the USB stick became not just an object, but a behavior. We learned to carry our work, our hobbies, our small digital attachments in our pockets. The world became transportable. Identity compressed. Memory assignable. It was, in many ways, a polite decentralization, a rebellion not of noise, but of permission. And now, as you sit here with us in the calm of the museum, the light brushing faintly against the brushed metal casing of our exhibit, we invite you to remember the last time you held one. Not the details, just the shape, the feel, the unassuming weight of a small object that once carried something precious or utterly forgettable from one place to another. Without drama, without sound, only presence. There is a certain architectural elegance in the silence of function. The USB stick, though mute, spoke fluently in the grammar of transfer. Its internal structure, so compact as to seem vacant, was a carefully nested harmony of intention. No hinges, no spindles, trembling in anxiety. Only circuits, soldered in modest loops, whispering to one another across etched silicon channels. And yet the object remained deceptively simple, as though embarrassed by its own sophistication. We now enter the phase where refinement replaced invention. After its quiet adoption across offices, campuses, and coat pockets, the USB stick began its long march through the narrowing corridor of miniaturization, not by necessity, but by trend. What was once a thumb became a fingernail, then a sliver, then a whisper, and with each reduction in size, the aura of trust expanded. The smaller it grew, the more we expected from it. More files, more speed, less heat, fewer failures. It was the technological equivalent of asking a hamster to store the Encyclopedia Britannica. Engineers responded with gentle heroism. They redesigned the internal controller chips to be more efficient, more agile. They developed newer iterations of flash memory, denser, faster, more obedient under stress. Write speeds increased. Power consumption decreased. The connector itself, once prone to wobbles and warping, was retooled with subtler tolerances, enabling the reassuring friction of insertion without requiring brute force. It became a ritual, a line, insert, transfer, remove, the modern equivalent of sealing a letter with wax. This era also brought standardization to chaos. USB generations proliferated, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, each promising swifter transfers and deeper compatibility. But the stick remained a constant. Regardless of port evolution, the principle held. Data should flow like water, not stumble like tourists. Labels on packaging grew more boastful. Store 1,000 songs. Carry your world. The object itself said nothing, of course. It merely waited. Here in the museum, one can observe a series of transitional specimens, each housed in identical display cases, arranged by nothing more than the gentle difference in port speed. The oldest still wears its clumsy logo like a mismatched tie. The most recent glints with hollow confidence, boasting neon plastic and retractable mechanisms. One even has a fingerprint reader. No visitor has ever used it. What was perhaps most remarkable in this quiet evolution was the rise of the bootable stick, no longer just a messenger of files. The USB stick learned to carry entire operating systems, miniature worlds inside. With careful formatting and a few arcane instructions, it could teach a computer how to be something else entirely. A recovery tool, a Linux playground, an escape hatch. The stick was not merely a servant to the machine. It was, on occasion, its master. This shift did not go unnoticed. System administrators began to hoard USB sticks like seeds against future droughts. Tech repair shops kept them in drawers, labeled in permanent marker. Diagnostics, wipe tool, install kit. Each was a silent toolkit capable of breathing life back into the wheezing lungs of a misbehaving laptop. They were not glamorous, but they were trusted. And that trust, once earned, calcified into habit. It is worth noting, too, that the USB stick enjoyed a peculiar relationship with human emotion. It was rarely celebrated, yet frequently blamed. When a file disappeared, suspicion fell on the stick. When a document was late, it was the stick's fault. Lost, corrupted, inexplicably unreadable. And yet we continued to use them, because beneath the muttered curses and ritual ejections lay a fundamental faith in small, quiet things that do as they are told. Even their physical imperfections became part of the charm. the faint rattle of a loose casing, the smudge of a forgotten fingerprint, the way some caps fit too tightly, others too loose. Some users added key rings, others wrapped them in rubber bands. They were not precious, but they were personal, like a well-worn bookmark or a favorite pen, quiet companions to our more elaborate tools. And then came the question of security. If the stick could carry so much, what was to prevent it from carrying too much? Encryption became a whispered necessity. Some manufacturers added hardware protection, password prompts, self-erasing protocols. Others simply offered advice. Don't lose it. Advice one notes that was rarely followed. Here in the archive's more recent wing, one may view the data leak wall, a timeline of unmarked USB sticks found in taxis, cafes, and public libraries, each displayed behind glass, wiped of content, labeled only by the location of its discovery. Most were ordinary. Some were curious. One contained only a single word file that read, "If you are reading this, congratulations. Please water the ficus." And still, through all this, the USB stick persisted, not because it was invincible, but because it was adequate. It asked so little. A port, a moment, a transfer. It made no sounds, no demands. It was a monastery of modern memory. As you listen now, perhaps you recall the click of one slipping into a slot, the blink of a tiny LED, the invisible dance of megabytes making their way across circuits. You did not hear them, but they moved. You did not see them, but they arrived. And in that space, between silence and certainty, the USB stick earned its place. If we listen closely to the quieter rhythms of technology, we may find that the USB stick was never in a hurry. It progressed not by leaps, but by persistence, advancing through offices and homes, like a slow, determined fog. It was never the headline, never the revolution, but it was always there, behind the monitor, inside the pocket, waiting. As demand grew, so too did production. The USB stick entered the realm of industrial repetition, factories across continents churning them out in numbers large enough to eclipse entire populations. The components, tiny wafers, transistors, insulators, were etched and soldered by machines more precise than most humans at their best. Automated lines pressed shells onto circuits, embossed logos, snapped plastic like dry leaves, and stacked finished units in trays. There was no glamour, only rhythm. One could say they were not manufactured so much as conjured in sequence. This scalability had consequences. Prices fell. Capacities rose. What once cost a portion of a paycheck now came free with a magazine or inside a cereal box. Promotional USB sticks appeared like unsolicited compliments, inscribed with slogans, mission statements, insurance hotline numbers. Many were never used. Some were used exactly once. A few were snapped in half by curious children or swallowed by briefcases never opened again. But in the great tide of production, something curious emerged. The USB stick became disposable. This was never the intention. The original promise was utility, not ephemerality, but abundance breeds neglect. And so they began to pile up, on desks, in kitchen drawers, in bowls beside the door, each one an unopened letter from the recent past. In the museum's storage wing, rarely visited, mostly whispered about, lies the archive of the unclaimed. Thousands of USB sticks, individually bagged and cataloged, each once lost, now collected. Most are anonymous. A few are labeled in blue ink, wedding slideshow, dad's taxes, backup, backup. contents remain untouched, not out of respect, but uncertainty. We do not know what they carry. We only know they carried something once. There's a particular poignancy in their standardization. Every stick looks slightly like every other. Different colors, maybe. Different logos. But fundamentally, rectangle, port, shell. Unlike a book or a photograph, the USB stick hides its soul. There is no visible cover, no hint at the contents. Its value lies inside, in ghostly architecture. You must connect it, trust it, to know it. In this way, it became a mirror of our habits, dense, portable, opaque. And as storage capacity ballooned, so too did the stakes. No longer were they simply for PowerPoint decks or a few songs ripped from a CD. They held portfolios, source code, thesis drafts, contracts, confessions, sometimes entire lives. A stick might sit silently on a lanyard for months, unnoticed, until the day it was needed, and then, with one click, it returned to relevance. No drama, just access. Yet despite its expansion in capacity, the physical form barely changed. This was its genius. The USB stick was never upgraded through flamboyance, only through quiet refinement. Inside, memory cells became more efficient. Outside, only the color of the plastic shifted. It was the ideal object for an impatient world, unchanging, unfussy, always ready. Of course, there were competitors. Cloud storage, external hard drives, wireless transfers. Each new method promised liberation from the tyranny of the port. And yet, for many, the USB stick endured, perhaps because it worked without passwords, perhaps because it asked no questions. You inserted it, and it obeyed. There was something comfortingly medieval about it. It did not update itself. It did not judge your bandwidth. It was simply there, and it worked. In this age of ephemeral software and shifting interfaces, the USB stick offered a physical relationship with data. You could hold it, drop it, forget it in a pocket, run it through the wash. It might survive. And if it didn't, well, that was part of the game. The risk, the thrill. Would it still mount? Would the contents be readable? Was final report, was final viewing, actually as final, still there, waiting? Here, in our dimly lit corridor of form factors, visitors can view the entire evolution of the stick, from the bulky early designs with extended cables to the compact units with retractable ports. Some were built with metal casings, others with biodegradable starch. One even includes a built-in bottle opener, though no one has successfully used it. The craftsmanship, if one can call it that, became an afterthought. As prices plummeted, so did tolerances. Caps no longer fit. Casings cracked. LEDs blinked too brightly, or not at all, but the core remained, the silent core that carried your files across space, and sometimes across time. And still, people handed them to each other with trust. Here, take this. A transaction of invisible weight, an exchange of electrons, emotion, and the occasional wedding video. No ceremony, no password, just plastic and faith. The USB stick, in its prime, was the perfect servant. Not glamorous, not loud, but essential, always essential, and often forgotten, until one day you needed it again. In the twilight years of its relevance, the USB stick began to retreat, not defiantly, but with quiet deference to a world that no longer needed to carry things by hand. Wireless transfer had matured, syncing became seamless, the cloud omnipresent. And yet the USB stick, ever grounded, remained still, not obsolete, just essential in quieter places. places. In hospitals, law offices, and rural schools, it endured, not because it was ideal, but because it was enough. Modest in purpose, it never asked to be remembered, only to be used. In our exhibit of quiet utilities, among paper clips and batteries, sits one such stick, scratched, anonymous, once home to spreadsheets and a file labeled important. JPG. No one lingers. That's the point. Even as it faded from mainstream use, the stick found a second life, embedded in walls by artists, used in anonymous exchanges, symbolic more than practical. A message in a bottle. Activists carried them through firewalls. Refugees carried memories in them. What looked like nothing often carried everything. There were imitators, gadgets shaped like sticks, doing other things. The form survived long after the function faded. Now, in our halls, they are not powered, not read, just displayed. Their contents erased, their presence preserved. They demand nothing. They perform nothing. And yet, in their stillness, they remind us, this was once how we trusted, how we shared, how we carried meaning. They offered no spectacle, only service. And now, even forgotten, they remain. A placeholder for when data had shape, when memory had form, and when we handed things over and said, without flourish, it's all in there. And we believed it. As the USB stick moved into maturity, it acquired a strange dignity. No longer the newest, fastest, or most admired, it began to resemble those quiet figures in a fading profession, reliable, slightly outdated, and universally respected. The world around it spun faster, gigabit internet, cloud synchronization, devices without ports at all. Yet the USB stick persisted, like a bench in a train station no one sits on anymore, but no one dares remove. This endurance was not born of innovation, but of inertia. So many systems, habits, and workflows had been built around its quiet presence that to remove it entirely would have meant more trouble than letting it remain. And so it lingered. In school labs, where students still submitted projects in folders titled Final to Real Final. In hospitals, where imaging files were transferred with surgical precision from one machine to the next. In airports, where departure screens were updated by men with lanyards and identical black sticks. And in the private sphere, it became a talisman of continuity, a backup of old photos, a dusty drive labeled important and fading marker, a collection of songs you no longer liked but could not bear to delete. The USB stick held what was too sentimental to lose, too trivial to upload. It became the museum drawer of our own indecision. Not all uses were noble. In time, the USB stick became a vector of malware, of unauthorized transfers, of quiet thefts. It could cross firewalls by pretending to be innocent. It did not need an internet connection. It needed only a moment of trust. For some, this was a flaw. For others, a feature. And yet the object itself remained impassive, uncaring of motive. It served without judgment. Here in the museum's subterranean wing of digital artifacts, one can see the display titled Dualities. On one side, a USB stick containing love letters and ultrasound images. On the other, one sees during a financial investigation, its contents encrypted, unreadable, intriguing. Between the two, nothing. Just a beam of light and a velvet ribbon demarcating curiosity from consequence. The USB stick never changed expression. That was part of its charm. Other devices lit up. Word updated themselves with little fanfare. the USB stick simply was. Inserted, it might glow with a subtle diode or remain dark altogether. There was no standard for communication, no assurance. You had to check, you had to believe. The act of using one was, in some sense, always a gamble. It also became a prop in culture. Spy films, thrillers, even sitcoms began to feature it, always as the critical object, passed from hand to hand, containing everything from nuclear codes to embarrassing vacation photos. Writers favored it for its ambiguity. It was the modern envelope, the locked drawer, the hidden compartment, suspense in plastic form. In the domestic world, they accumulated like digital pebbles. Few knew which ones still worked, which contained anything meaningful, which were blank. They were thrown into drawers with old batteries and business cards, and occasionally one would be found, perhaps labeled in a moment of rare foresight, and plugged in again. What it revealed was sometimes joyful, sometimes forgotten, often both. Children discovered them with wonder. "What is this?" they asked, holding the small object like an artifact from another age. And adults, trying to explain, realized that they were speaking about a tool that required explanation. Something simple, now strange. "It stores data," they'd say. But that wasn't quite it. It stored a way of being, and perhaps that is what the USB stick now represents most clearly. A moment extended beyond its relevance, where we still believed in the physicality of information, in keeping things close, in holding memory in our hands, not in clouds, in our museum's quietest hall, lit by ambient reflections and cooled to archival standards. The USB exhibit is not interactive. There are no touchscreens, no projections, just the sticks themselves, each seated upright in sandblasted acrylic, like seeds frozen in amber. We do not ask you to use them, only to notice that they remain, each one a little monolith, unreadable, self-contained, whispering nothing, until someone asks. In the twilight years of its dominance, the USB stick began to show signs of graceful withdrawal, not in defiance, but in quiet deference to a world that no longer needed to carry things by hand. Wireless transfer had grown teeth. Syncing had become seamless. The cloud, once vague and untrustworthy, now shimmered with ubiquity. Files floated. Updates rippled across devices like migrating birds. And the USB stick, ever grounded, stood still. Yet its stillness was not emptiness. In many places, the USB stick remained essential, not because it was new, but because it was known. It required no network, no login, no terms of service. In hospitals, it persisted as a bearer of scans when connectivity faltered. In law offices, it lingered as a physical medium for sensitive transfers, its very opacity considered a virtue. And in rural schools, where bandwidth was a theory more than a fact, it served as the faithful donkey on a mountain path of data. These environments did not fetishize the stick. They simply relied on it, not because it was ideal, but because it was enough. And in that modesty, the USB stick revealed a strange kind of nobility. It never asked to be remembered, only to be used. Here, in our display of quiet utilities, you'll find a modest collection: paper clips, rubber bands, A batteries, and among them a USB stick, black, anonymous, slightly scratched. A placard nearby reads, "Survived 10 years in an accountant's bag. Contained 6 spreadsheets, 1 backup of tax year 7, and a photo labeled important.jpg. Subject unclear. visitors rarely linger. That is the point. Even as the device lost ground in consumer spaces, it enjoyed a peculiar renaissance in the arts. Digital minimalists adopted it as a medium for poetry. USBs left in public spaces, loaded with text fragments and small compositions. Others engaged in dead drop culture. Urban USBs cemented into walls, waiting to share something, anything, with those curious enough to kneel and plug in. These gestures were not always legal, nor were they always safe, but they underscored something true, that the USB stick, even in its obsolescence, retained symbolic weight. It was a message in a bottle, a digital coin flip between threat and gift, and so it lived on in pockets of resistance. Activists used them to smuggle documents through firewalls of censorship. Investigators carried them into courtrooms. Refugees held them close, with photos of homes now vanished. Each stick was unremarkable to the eye, but heavy with implication. You could mistake it for nothing until you looked inside. Of course, there were also stick-shaped imposters. Gadgets disguised as USB sticks, but hiding other purposes. Voice recorders, keyloggers, even lighters. In the endless corridor of novelty, the form endured longer than its original function. The shape had become iconic, short, rectangular, tapered, recognizable even in silhouette. Designers found this silhouette irresistible. Even now, in the museum gift shop, one may purchase a USB-shaped eraser. It stores nothing. It removes things. Back in the main hall, we offer no demonstrations. The sticks are not plugged in. They do not flash or respond. They are exhibited not as relics, but as resting tools, retired, not expired. Each one sits in a cradle of brushed felt, identified only by model name and port generation. No data is accessible. All content is permanently erased. A curatorial choice, not a technical one. Some visitors express disappointment. Others seem relieved. What is perhaps most fascinating, as one reflects on the arc of the USB stick, is how seamlessly it dissolved into the fabric of daily life. At no point did it demand admiration. It offered no spectacle. It was the invisible hinge on which small moments of modernity turned. A contract handed over. A song copied for a friend. A school report recovered minutes before deadline. It never asked to be remembered, but here we are, remembering it anyway, for that is the strange dignity of the truly boring thing. It stays, long after its purpose has faded, long after the systems have moved on. It sits, small and neutral, a placeholder for a time when transfer meant contact, when data had shape, when memory was still something you could hand to someone and say, without flourish, "It's all in there." And they'd believe you. As with all tools that outlive their origin stories, the USB stick eventually entered a phase best described as cultural ambient. It no longer announced itself. It simply was, nestled between generations of more vocal, more agile technologies. Where once it had been a protagonist in the silent play of file exchange, it became stage dressing, always there, rarely noticed. This invisibility had a side effect. It fostered a quiet intimacy. One did not boast about a USB stick. One reached for it absent-mindedly, as one might reach for a pen. You didn't ask, "Is this a good stick?" You asked, "Is this the one I use for the photos?" The object became a conduit for personal doubt, hope, and memory. And if If it didn't contain what you thought, it was your fault, not its. The physical design plateaued. Manufacturers realized that the elegance was largely irrelevant. Utility reigned. So the sticks became flatter, smoother, even more forgettable. Colors became a marketing afterthought. Neon green, corporate blue, carbon pattern black. Some bore LED indicators that blinked anxiously during transfer. Others remained stoic, betraying nothing. The cap became the weak point, often lost, never mourned. A drawer full of USB sticks was a drawer full of Schrodinger's data. Each might contain treasure, or trash, or nothing at all. They were capsules of uncertainty, small enough to escape guilt, large enough to imply meaning. You didn't throw them away, but you didn't check them either. You simply moved them from drawer to drawer, home to home, like thumb-sized totems of unresolved digital history. In the museum's domestic technology wing, we feature a piece titled Migration. Dozens of USB sticks embedded in clear resin, arranged like sediment layers. Some are pristine. Others bear bite marks, scratches, melted edges. Each was recovered from a home undergoing renovation, its previous owner either indifferent or absent. None have been opened. The mystery is part of the structure. Visitors often ask what's inside. We tell them exactly what you expect, and absolutely nothing you could have predicted. Meanwhile, new generations grew up without the ritual of the USB stick. They saved to the cloud. They airdropped. They tapped screens and spoke to assistants. To them, the idea of carrying files in plastic seemed charmingly obsolete. Yet some adopted it ironically. USB sticks shaped like sushi, avocados, tiny hammers. As a joke, as aesthetic, a technological vinyl. Others took it seriously. Archivists began to worry. What if platforms failed? What if accounts vanished? The cloud was not a cloud. It was someone else's server. And so the USB stick returned to relevance in archival circles. Cold storage, offline backups, a museum of information that needed to remain untouched. No updates, no sync, just presence. Even militaries kept them, for air-gapped systems, for secure transfers. A USB stick, properly handled, could be trusted more than a cable reaching into the wrong network. Its simplicity was its strength. It could not be hacked from afar. It could only be stolen the old-fashioned way, with hands. The museum maintains a sealed vault known as the Cold Archive. Inside, rows of USB sticks rest in static-free trays, each labeled in handwriting, not barcodes. The data is mirrored elsewhere, but the sticks remain as proof. Each one contains a project that once mattered, recordings, manifests, raw footage. In time, these formats may become unreadable, but the objects will remain. That is the dual tragedy and triumph of physical storage. It degrades, but it endures. At the far end of the corridor, a single stick is encased in glass. It is unremarkable. No logo, no label. It is paired with a plaque that reads, "Last verified file, transfer successful." Nothing corrupted, nothing lost. And that, perhaps, is the best any tool can hope for. As time moved forward, the USB stick remained, not central, but persistent, like a half-remembered song that resurfaces during moments of practical need. By now, it had become more than just a storage medium. It was a cultural residue, embedded in routines we no longer questioned. Some found new uses. Artists began to treat USB sticks not as devices, but as vessels for conceptual work. Limited edition albums were released exclusively on sticks shaped like the band's logo. Digital art was sold not on websites, but on a medium that could be signed, touched, held. In an age of infinite duplication, the USB stick offered something oddly permanent. It could be gifted. It could be forgotten in a drawer and rediscovered years later, like a letter. The act of plugging one in became ceremonial. You weren't just opening a file, you were opening a time capsule. And sometimes you didn't. You left it closed, unread, respecting the mystery it contained. In this way, the USB stick became not only a memory device, but a metaphor of what we carry and what we choose not to revisit. It also began to appear in literature. Writers, keen to represent the quiet artifacts of everyday life, started including USB sticks as narrative devices. A character finds one. It holds secrets. It fails to load. It triggers events. It does nothing. The ambiguity became part of its charm. Schrodinger's stick, filled with both revelation and redundancy until proven otherwise. At the museum's rotating exhibit, we feature Fiction and Function, where USB sticks from published novels and screenplays are recreated based on the descriptions alone. Each one rests beside a short excerpt. He slipped the silver stick into her coat pocket and walked away. Or she found it in the drawer, labeled for emergencies only, and hesitated. Visitors often lean in, expecting a screen, a light, something. But the sticks remain inert. That is the point. Outside the museum, society continued to drift away from hardware. Portless devices multiplied. Laptops arrived without USB-A sockets. Smartphones communicated only through cloud services and proprietary docks. The USB stick, once ubiquitous, became a small logistical problem. You now needed an adapter to use it. That small indignity, carrying a stick and a dongle, marked the beginning of exile. Yet it was not disgraceful. Objects that outlive their natural habitat often take on symbolic weight. Think of the fountain pen, the typewriter, the wristwatch with winding gears. These things did not vanish. They slowed. They calcified. They acquired reverence. So it was with the USB stick. It became a collector's item, not for rarity, but for resonance. Early models, still functional, were auctioned. Unusual shapes, once marketing novelties, were displayed in glass cases. Custom firmware versions designed for one narrow purpose became objects of study. People began to ask, what did we do with these? And more quietly, what have we lost now that we don't? One floor down from the main exhibition, the museum hosts a listening room. It is dark, carpeted, quiet. Along the wall are USB ports, some standard, some obscure. Visitors may bring their own stick, insert it, and listen as a soft voice read the names of the files it contains. No content is opened, just the names, just the trace. Some find this moving. Others find it absurd, but most sit still, listening. Family photos, thesis draft, don't delete this, hello, a text, the past laid bare, not in what was said, but in what was saved. And then quietly, they removed the stick. No fanfare, no beeping, just silence. The same silence with which the USB stick always operated. Calm, unjudging, and complete. There is a particular stillness that follows utility, the kind that gathers around things no longer needed, but not yet gone. The USB stick settled into this quiet phase with dignity, not clinging, not vanishing, but simply remaining. It had nothing to prove. It had already done the job. Yet as the decades crept forward, its environment continued to shift. The tools around it grew abstract, operating in clouds, containers, ephemeral layers of logic and redundancy. Files no longer traveled, they were streamed. Ownership became subscription, and the idea of carrying data began to seem quaint, like sending a telegram by bicycle. Still, in the corners of professional life, the USB stick endured, not as standard, but as fallback. The device you reached for when everything else failed. A file wouldn't send. Transfer it by stick. A presentation wouldn't sync. Use the stick. The network was down. The stick again. It was the technological equivalent of a fire escape. Rarely used, but comforting to know it was there. In some institutions, its use became ceremonial. A new employee received one as part of onboarding, not because it was strictly needed, but because it was tradition, a token of inclusion. Here's your stick. As though to say, you are now part of the system, you carry data, you share responsibility. The museum's exhibit titled Tokens of Entry includes one such USB stick, unopened, shrink-wrapped, embossed with the logo of a now-defunct bank. It contains a welcome video and a PDF titled Our Values. The file hasn't been viewed in 12 years, but it is still there, elsewhere in more personal domains. The USB stick became a vessel for farewells. People backed up their old photos before switching devices, intending to sort through them later. Most never did. The stick became a sealed archive of intentions, promises to organize, promises to remember. And slowly, these promises solidified, no longer waiting to be fulfilled, simply waiting to be preserved. Some were left behind deliberately, found in boxes of belongings after someone passed. A handful of megabytes containing a life, notes, jokes, playlists, drafts. Others were returned by post. I think this is yours. The recipient often did not remember what was on it, but plugged it in just in case. The USB stick also found new roles in education, not as a primary tool, but as a curiosity. Teachers explained its function as part of digital history, like floppy disks before it. Students held them with cautious amusement. This is what we used before the cloud. The students nodded, unsure if they were witnessing nostalgia or fiction. At the museum's education desk, we offer visitors a chance to record a single file, a sentence, a sound, a thought, and save it onto a USB stick. The stick is then placed in an anonymous archive. It will not be opened. The only record of its contents is a card stating a file was saved. The exact title is burned into the card. Nothing else. No context. No copy. It is a small ritual, a way of saying this existed. It was saved. That is enough. Outside the museum, a few sticks still pass between hands. Old habits die slowly. A contractor leaves one with a client. A musician shares a demo. A friend gives another friend a stick with videos from a forgotten holiday. The act feels faintly anachronistic, but sincere, as if to say, I made this portable for you. I thought of you specifically. This is what the USB stick came to symbolize. Not speed, not efficiency, but intention. To use one meant deciding, choosing to carry, choosing to give. Not everything had to float in the cloud. Some things could still be held, and that, more than its circuitry, more than its silicon or shell, is what made the USB stick matter. It was a small, inert thing, but it required your hand. It asked you to remember. There is something profoundly human about the desire to hold on to things, not merely in mind, but in matter. The USB stick, humble and mute, served that urge quietly, providing not permanence, but the illusion of it. An object small enough to be forgotten, yet dense enough to carry significance. As digital ecosystems move toward ephemerality, streams, sinks, distributed states, the USB stick stood firm in its material assertion. I am here. I contain. I persist. This stubborn presence became both its charm and its curse. It was reliable, yes, but increasingly it was inconvenient. And the modern world punishes inconvenience swiftly. So began the second obsolescence, not of the stick itself, but of the ports. Laptops arrived sleek, portless, unapologetic. USB-A was no longer welcome. In its place came the new, the reversible, the slim, USB-C, and with it a shift in attitude, from interface as access to interface as fashion. Adapters were born, those tiny bridges between yesterday and today. They multiplied in drawers and backpacks, each one a small apology for progress. A USB stick could still function, of course, but it needed permission now, an interpreter, a favor from the future. The museum's exhibit, Bridges and Bastards, showcases these adapters, short cables, plug converters, plastic contraptions, each one solving a problem that didn't exist until yesterday, each one silently mocking the permanence of design. Visitors often laugh. Sometimes they sigh. Meanwhile, the USB stick continued to drift into marginal use. It became a tool of last resort, a backup for the backup, the physical manifestation of just in case. IT technicians kept them in kits. Disaster recovery plans mentioned them, and sometimes, crucially, they saved the day. One such stick rests in our critical infrastructure archive, unmarked, battered. It was used during a blackout to restore the firmware of a regional control system. A technician found it in a forgotten drawer, used it without ceremony, and prevented a cascading failure. No one thanked the stick. It didn't ask for thanks. Elsewhere, nostalgia began to gather around the device like dust. Not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. A time when computing had weight, when a file transfer had to be done, not merely triggered, when memory was something you carried, not something that followed you. Artists began to use them in sculptures, embedded in resin, chained together like relics. One installation, What We Meant to Keep, featured hundreds of USB sticks dangling from ceiling wires, each labeled with phrases like, "Photos I never sorted," "Drafts of things," "His music," "The real backup," each one unreadable, each one a confession. In more remote corners of the world, the stick remained practical. Places without broadband, places where physical transport was still faster than digital. A USB stick handed over in person was still faster than a network that didn't exist. In those contexts, it was not obsolete. It was indispensable. And then, quietly, it entered the gray market of utility. Devices shipped with hidden payloads. Cheap branded sticks used for advertising or surveillance. The stick had no allegiance. It was carrier, not cause. A container of whatever was placed inside, good, bad, ambiguous. The world projected onto it. It remained still. In our display titled Vectors and Vessels, we exhibit confiscated USB sticks from various incidents, corporate leaks, anonymous drops, accidental infections. Each one sits behind protective glass. They are safe now, but they remind us, no object is inherently innocent. Still, the most common stick is the forgotten one, found in a drawer, pocket, the lining of a bag, plugged in with curiosity. What's on this one again? And sometimes, just sometimes, it's something worth keeping. A photo, a song, a file that was lost, but not lost. A small miracle of poor housekeeping. And you smile, not because the stick is special, but because it waited, without complaint, without need. It simply waited. Eventually, all tools drift toward ritual. The USB stick, once modern, then mundane, now hovers on the edge of the ceremonial. It is no longer used because it is needed, but because it marks an occasion. A file is not merely saved, it is given, handed over as if passing a torch. And in this act, the USB stick becomes less a device, more a gesture. We see this often in interviews, lectures, small transactions between humans who value tangibility. Here is the presentation. This is the final version. You'll find everything on this. The sentences are spoken with a hint of finality, as if to say, I've done my part. Now it's yours. At the museum, we sometimes receive USB sticks in the mail. No letter, no context. Just the stick. Some are blank. Others contain folders with names like README or For the Archive. We never open them, not because of policy, but because of restraint. The donation is not the content. It is the object, offered freely, like a coin tossed into a well. This, too, is the stick's legacy. Quiet participation. It never imposed itself. It never insisted. You had to ask something of it. You had to choose it. And in a world of automated syncing and background uploads, that kind of choice feels almost radical. Designers noticed. Boutique manufacturers began releasing limited edition USB sticks, wooden, metallic, hand-carved. Some were artisanal to the point of absurdity, others minimalist, bearing only weight and form. They were meant to be touched, passed, remembered. The data inside was incidental. Collectors emerged. Not many, but enough. Forms began cataloging obscure models, strange shapes, regional releases, misprints. A particularly rare find was a stick shaped like a credit card, distributed as a promotional item for a 2004 Technology Expo. It contained only a single HTML file that read, "Welcome to the future." The museum acquired two. One remains sealed. The other is on display, looped into a rotating cube of mirrored panels, its reflection multiplied into absurdity. Visitors often lean in, expecting interactivity. They find only silence, and their own image refracted. Outside these curated spaces, the USB stick has become something between tool and relic, a bookmark in time. Its continued existence in certain industries is not a failure of progress, but a reminder that speed is not everything. Sometimes what matters is presence, the act of placing something into someone's hand and saying, "Here, it's all in there." That phrase, in fact, has become a kind of epitaph. We use it still, even when handing over something that could have been emailed, because deep down we remember what it means. It means the transfer is complete, the task is done, the weight is now yours. Among the final additions to our main collection is a USB stick embedded in a fountain pen. It belonged to a retired professor. He used it for lectures. Inside were folders titled by semester, each one more sparsely populated than the last. The final folder contains only a file called Closing Thoughts, Doc, a half-written note about why he preferred lecturing from physical media. It ends mid-sentence. We did not finish it. We did not add to it. We archived it as it was. A sentence paused, a thought suspended. The USB stick, after all, was never meant to conclude, only to carry. And even now, it does. In the end, it is not the death of a device that defines it, but how gently it disappears. The USB stick did not collapse in failure. It was not recalled, rejected, or reviled. It simply faded. Like all unglamorous tools, it left not with ceremony, but with absence. And yet, traces remain. In offices, a few still cling to relevance. Internal policies cite them. Security protocols ban them. Training slides warn of their risks. But the object itself sits quietly in drawers, tangled among paper clips and expired access cards. No one throws it away. No one remembers why it was kept. At conferences, the branded USB stick has become a punchline. Still doing these? Someone asks. A shrug. People expect something to take home. Rarely is it plugged in. Rarely is it erased. It becomes detritus with a logo, an afterthought in lanyard form. But the device persists where it always did best, where silence is needed, where infrastructure is poor or caution is high. Humanitarian workers use them to carry translated documents into regions with no network. Drone operators use them to patch firmware in the field. In submarines, where signals cannot travel, the USB stick is still how one system teaches another. The museum's silent interfaces collection includes one such specimen, a USB stick encased in waterproof resin, used by researchers on polar expeditions. It contains data about weather patterns, ice density, and a spreadsheet titled simply, Food. A note in the accompanying logbook reads, copied to backup before departure, kept original on person, just in case. That instinct to carry something so small, just in case, is what gave the USB stick its life. And that is how it lingers now. Not central, not current, but possible. A backup plan, a physical assurance. You cannot misplace the cloud, but you cannot grasp it either. The USB stick offered both risk and reassurance, tangibility in exchange for uncertainty. That trade still appeals in quiet corners. At the end of our primary exhibit is a hallway, dimly lit, where a single USB port glows faintly on a museum pedestal. Visitors may insert a stick of their own. No data is read, no files are copied, but the port lights up, acknowledges. A soft chime plays. Then silence. The message is clear. You are still seen. And so we close this chapter, not with obsolescence, but with transition. The USB stick has not ended. It has dissolved into the cultural mulch of yesterday's tools. It has left behind no grand farewell, no obituaries, only objects, scattered and waiting, filled with fragments of what mattered once. It may not be needed anymore, but it remains possible. And in that possibility lies its last function. What remains of a tool when its purpose has passed? Not the plastic, not the circuits. Those dissolve, crack, fade. What remains is the echo of intention, the memory of use. And the USB stick, though small, carries that echo in abundance. It is not remembered for what it was. It is remembered for what it allowed. To carry, to transfer, to hand over. In its modest form lay a quiet philosophy, that information could be made physical, that the digital could be touched, passed, and protected. The USB stick was never ambitious. It did not aspire. It only served. And in this humility, it became something rare, a neutral artifact in a world thick with opinion. Symbols often grow from absence, And now that the USB stick has begun to vanish from desks and pockets, it has begun to appear elsewhere, in metaphors, in art, in ritual. It is used to represent memory, anonymity, portability, trust. It is the modern locket, the digital envelope, the tiny tomb of forgotten things. We often imagine digital life as cloud-like, formless, floating, immense. The USB stick opposed that. It was contained, definite. It could be held, and lost, and found. And in that cycle, it mirrored us. For we too store things imperfectly. We remember partially. We carry more than we realize, and often forget what we've kept. The stick taught us about scale, that something as unassuming as a thumb-sized object could hold an entire semester, a career, a grief, and how easily it could be wiped, dropped, or overwritten. It embodied fragility and potential, two qualities rarely paired in the same shape. In the museum's contemplative chamber, a room with no displays, only chairs and low light, we ask visitors to sit with one USB stick, chosen from a bowl of blank ones. They are asked not to plug it in, not to examine it, only to hold it for a while and think, what would you store if this were your only chance? Responses vary. Some say music, some say letters, some say nothing. They'd leave it blank and let someone else decide. The USB stick becomes a prompt, a placeholder for choice. Not for data, but for meaning. This is where its true power resides. Not in storage capacity, not in transfer speed, but in the permission it offers. To extract, to preserve, to share. It democratized memory. You did not need to be technical. You needed only to click, to drag, to care. That was enough. Now, as we float toward a world without cables, without ports, perhaps even without files, the USB stick becomes more than a device. It becomes a reminder that once, not long ago, we lived among things that did not update themselves, that remembered nothing unless we asked them to, that waited patiently to be given meaning. It asked for nothing, and it carried everything. And so we return quietly, without fanfare, to the small object in its case, the USB stick, silent, unplugged, not dead, only still. Its journey was never dramatic. It did not explode, disrupt, or enthrall. It merely worked. It slipped into daily life like a well-worn phrase, unnoticed until it was gone. And now, in its fading presence, we see it more clearly, not as an innovation, but as a gesture. To give someone a USB stick was to say, I trust you with this. I saved it for you. I carried it here, in my pocket, through rain and errands and silence. That gesture is not replaced by sinking. It is only forgotten. In its final role, the USB stick becomes something deeper. Not a container, but a mirror. It holds what we gave it, and it waits, not to be read, but to be remembered. A drawer of sticks becomes a drawer of unsaid things, a handful of rectangles, each with a story that no longer opens. That, too, is memory. The museum's last room is not a room at all, but a corridor. No exhibits, no lighting, only a bench. There, visitors are invited to sit and recall their last USB stick, its color, its weight, what it held, whether it was ever plugged in again. Most remember one, some remember many, a few remember none, but believe they must have had one once. This belief is enough, because the USB stick does not insist. It does not remind. It only receives. And when forgotten, it does not complain. It taught us that memory can be carried, that ideas can travel in silence, that meaning can fit in a pocket and require only a moment of trust. We gave it our drafts, our photos, our resumes, our doubts. It kept them without question. It was not smart. It was not connected. But it was there. And now, as we move on to clouds and sync and speed, there is a small part of us that still looks for it. In drawers, in old bags, in the folds of coats not worn since last winter. The USB stick remains, if not in use, then in rhythm. The habit of saving. The instinct to hand something over. The belief that even in silence something can be preserved. And so the USB stick, unfashioned and unfussy, rests again. Soft in memory, flexible in meaning, always ready to begin anew.